What happens when a government keeps threatening a war it can no longer actually fight? For 9 quiet days, a single cargo ship sat parked in a Malaysian port, and nobody in the world was watching. Weeks later, that same ship was dead in the water in the Strait of Hormuz, its engine room blown open, and Marines were dropping onto its deck from the night sky. Before we go further, if stories like this keep you thinking long after the video ends, do me a favor and hit subscribe, tap the like button, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is only about oil. This channel is going to keep pulling on this thread, and you will not want to miss where it leads. Let's start with the ship itself, because the ship is where this entire story actually begins. Her name, at least the name painted on her hull that week, was the Tusca. Nearly 300 meters long, roughly the size of an American aircraft carrier, she looked, on paper, like just another commercial vessel moving cargo across the Arabian Sea. But paper is exactly the problem here. Ships like the Tusca are built to look ordinary. Their entire value comes from blending in. To understand why one aging cargo ship could bring a regional superpower to its knees, you have to rewind the clock past this war, past this year, and go back to 2018, the year the nuclear deal with Iran collapsed. When Washington reimposed sweeping sanctions on Iranian oil, Tehran faced a brutal choice: accept economic collapse or find a way around the rules. Iran chose the second option, and it chose it aggressively. Over the following years, Iran quietly built something that intelligence analysts now simply call the Shadow Fleet. Picture a small armada of aging tankers and cargo ships, many with ownership records buried under layers of shell companies. Their flags change every few months, their names get repainted at sea, and most tellingly, their tracking signals go dark the moment they enter contested waters. Iran was not the first country to try this. Venezuela built a similar shadow network to survive its own sanctions. Russia expanded. One after the invasion of Ukraine cut it off from Western markets. But Iran had a head start, and by the early 2020s, this hidden fleet was quietly keeping the Iranian economy breathing, moving discounted crude oil to buyers willing to look the other way. Here's how the system actually works, because it is smarter than most people realize. These ships almost never sail directly from an Iranian port to a foreign buyer. That would be too easy to trace. Instead, they loiter offshore. They transfer cargo from ship to ship in open water, far from any coast guard. They pass through transshipment hubs scattered across Southeast Asia and the Persian Gulf, and by the time the cargo reaches its final destination, its origin has been buried under so many transfers that proving where it came from becomes almost impossible. Port Klang in Malaysia, where the Tusca sat quietly for 9 days, has functioned as exactly this kind of laundering station for years. Ships arrive with murky histories, they wait, paperwork gets rewritten, and then they continue on, cleaner on paper than they ever were in reality. None of that, on its own, was unusual. Ships do this constantly, and most of them slip through without anyone noticing. What made the Tusca's voyage different was what happened after it left port, and why the United States decided this particular ship would not be allowed to slip through quietly. To understand that, we need to talk about how this war actually started, because the public timeline and the real timeline are not quite the same thing. Peace talks brokered out of Islamabad had been holding an uneasy calm together through the early months of this year. Then, in the middle of April, those talks collapsed completely. Both sides blame each other for walking away from the table, and the full truth of who broke first may never be fully public. But the practical result was immediate and unmistakable. Washington shifted from quietly enforcing sanctions to something far more aggressive, a full naval blockade of every Iranian port. That distinction matters more than it might sound. Sanctions enforcement, historically, meant tracking suspicious ships from a distance, occasionally stopping one, applying financial pressure through banks and shipping insurers. A blockade is something else entirely. A blockade means physically closing the door and standing in front of it with warships. More than half a dozen American destroyers, working alongside the Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, spread out across the Arabian Sea and the Strait of Hormuz with one simple standing order: nothing moves in or out of Iranian waters without American clearance. Sit with how enormous that actually is. The Strait of Hormuz is, by almost every measure, the single most important choke point in the global energy trade. Roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil, along with a massive share of its liquefied natural gas, passes through a channel that narrows at its tightest point to barely more than 20 meters wide. For decades, Iran treated its location next to that channel as leverage. Whenever tensions with the West spiked, Tehran would threaten to shut the strait down entirely, and the world would nervously watch oil prices spike in response. But this year, for the first time in a long time, that leverage flipped direction. It was no longer Iran threatening to close Hormuz. It was the United States effectively deciding who was allowed to use it at all. Iran had seen a version of this movie before, and that history explains why officials in Tehran understood the danger the moment it started. Back in 2019, Britain seized an Iranian tanker near Gibraltar, accusing it of shipping oil to Syria in violation of sanctions. Within weeks, Iran's Revolutionary Guard retaliated by seizing a British-flagged tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. That tit-for-tat pattern became the unspoken rulebook for years afterward. One side takes a ship, the other side takes a different ship in response, and the whole thing plays out quietly through back-channel diplomacy and away from cameras. What makes the seizure of the Tusca different is not the act itself. It is the scale, and it is the audience. Earlier incidents involved a single tanker, boarded quietly, with almost no footage and barely a headline. This time, there was a full blockade posture, a filmed helicopter assault, and a sitting American president narrating the entire operation on social media within hours of it happening. Iran has been through seizures before. It had simply never seen one with this kind of spotlight attached to it. Before we go deeper into exactly how this operation unfolded minute by minute, if you are the kind of person who actually wants to understand what is happening in the world instead of just scrolling past headlines, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Now let's walk through exactly how the United States identifies, targets, and disables a ship like this, because the mechanics here are far more deliberate than the raw footage lets on. Start with the basic problem American commanders were facing. The Strait of Hormuz and the surrounding waters see enormous volumes of completely legitimate shipping every single day. Tankers and cargo vessels from dozens of countries move oil, grain, electronics, and everyday goods through that channel constantly. A blockade cannot simply stop every ship that approaches. That would strangle global trade far beyond anything aimed at Iran, and it would instantly turn neutral trading nations into furious adversaries. So the actual enforcement system works less like a wall and more like a filter. Every vessel approaching the strait gets tracked using a combination of satellite surveillance, radar coverage from the destroyers stationed nearby, and something called the automatic identification system, a transponder signal that most commercial ships are legally required to broadcast at all times. Think of it less like a locked gate and more like an airport security line that only pulls aside the passengers who trip a specific set of warning flags. An Iranian-flagged vessel is an automatic flag. A vessel with ownership records tracing back to sanctioned companies is a flag, and a vessel that has gone dark, meaning its transponder mysteriously stopped broadcasting for a stretch of the voyage, is possibly the biggest flag of all. Legitimate commercial shipping has no real reason to vanish from tracking systems mid-journey. The Tusca appears to have tripped several of these warning signs at once. Its recent stop in Port Klang, a known laundering hub for exactly this kind of shadow cargo, had already put American investigators on alert long before the ship ever entered the strait. When analysts dug into its ownership structure, they reportedly found a maze of shell companies with commercial links stretching back into China, the kind of tangled ownership that legitimate shipping almost never bothers to build, because legitimate shipping has nothing to hide in the first place. It is worth understanding exactly how a ship goes dark, because the phrase gets thrown around loosely in headlines. Automatic identification transponders broadcast a ship's location, speed, and identity continuously. Switching one off mid-voyage is technically simple. It is a single switch on the bridge. But shadow fleet operators have turned this into something close to an art form. Transponders get switched off during the least monitored stretches of a journey. Ship names and registries get quietly repainted while at sea, and in some cases, vessels will briefly broadcast the identity of a completely different legitimate ship, a trick known as identity spoofing, designed to confuse satellite trackers watching from above. None of these tricks are foolproof, and once a pattern like this shows up enough times on the same hull, it starts building a case file. Eventually, that case file gets a ship intercepted. Once a vessel is flagged, the next question becomes what to actually do about it. And that is where the Blockade's rules of engagement come into play. The stated protocol starts with the warning phase. Hail the vessel by radio. Demand it stop for inspection. Give the crew a window to comply. In the Tusca's case, that window stretched to 6 hours. That is a remarkably long runway by military standards, and it suggests one of two things. Either American commanders were genuinely hoping to avoid a violent confrontation, or they were under strict orders to make the eventual use of force look as clearly justified as humanly possible. Maybe both. Either way, the ship kept moving. And when a vessel refuses to stop, commanders are left with only two real choices: escalate or let it slip through. Letting it through would have defeated the entire purpose of the blockade. So the destroyer assigned to intercept the Tusca fired, and it fired with precision, aiming specifically for the engine room. Not the hull, not the bridge. The engine room. That targeting decision tells you almost everything about what the operation was actually trying to accomplish. Sinking the ship outright would have destroyed the cargo, and Any evidence along with it, it would have handed Iran a genuine humanitarian disaster if crew members had died in the process. Disabling the engine room instead achieves the real military goal: stop the ship, preserve the ability to search it, and turn whatever is found inside into both intelligence and public justification for the entire blockade strategy. That is where the second phase begins, the part that actually made global headlines, the boarding operation itself. In naval terms, this is called a VBSS operation, short for visit. Board, search, and seizure. It is a tactic with a long history in counter-piracy work, though it is rarely carried out at this scale, and even more rarely carried out with this much of the world watching. Marines fast roping down from helicopters onto a hostile deck sounds like something out of an action film. And visually, it is. But functionally, once the ship has already been disabled, this is closer to an extremely well-armed customs inspection than an actual battlefield assault. The ship cannot move. The crew has no realistic way to resist a fully equipped Marine expeditionary unit. The real danger in operations like this comes less from the possibility of a firefight and more from the unpredictability of boarding an unfamiliar vessel in total darkness, not knowing what structural damage, hidden compartments, or panicked crew members might be waiting below deck. You might reasonably ask why the United States chose this dramatic public approach instead of simpler alternatives, like quietly shadowing the ship and dealing with it diplomatically once it reached a friendly port. The answer comes down to one word: deterrence. A quiet diplomatic seizure sends no message to the next captain deciding whether to test the blockade. A filmed public seizure, complete with a presidential post describing exactly how the ship was warned, refused, and disabled, sends a message that is impossible to misread. This was never just about one ship. It was a demonstration, engineered specifically to be watched by every captain still weighing whether to risk a run through Hormuz, and by every government still trying to figure out whether America's threats carried real weight or were just words. We are just past a third of the way through this story, and honestly, it only gets more layered from here. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this conflict properly, instead of just watching a headline scroll by. Hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who need the full picture instead of the 30-second version. Now let's talk about the legal argument behind all of this, because it matters more than most coverage gives it credit for. Washington's justification rests on tying the blockade directly to existing sanctions regimes, targeting Iranian military and weapons-related trade, which gives American forces legal authority to search and seize vessels reasonably suspected of carrying prohibited cargo. Whether that legal framing would survive serious international scrutiny is a genuinely separate question from whether it is currently being enforced. And right now, enforcement is the only variable that actually matters to captains trying to cross that stretch of water. There's another detail here that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Investigators were not simply relying on gut instinct and a few warning flags. According to multiple reports, American Central Command has spent months quietly building a systematic profile of Iran's entire shadow fleet, cross-referencing satellite tracking data with known transshipment patterns. That means catching a ship like the Tusca was not really luck. It was the product of a slow, patient surveillance campaign that had been running in the background long before this particular vessel ever entered anyone's crosshairs. Now let's step back from the mechanics of the seizure and look at the bigger war underneath it, because there is a second conflict happening here that most headlines completely miss. This is a war fought with balance sheets, frozen bank accounts, and carefully scripted state broadcasts. And in many ways, this quieter war may end up deciding how the whole conflict actually ends. Start with the raw economics, because they are brutal in a way that is easy to state and genuinely hard to fully absorb. The United States estimates that the blockade alone is draining roughly $500 million a day from an Iranian economy that was already struggling under years of prior sanctions. $500 million every single day. American Central Command has reported intercepting somewhere around 85 vessels attempting to move through Iranian waters since the blockade began, with 3 ships fully seized outright, the Tusca among them. Independent maritime tracking data suggests only a small fraction of attempted crossings, somewhere around 24, have actually made it through unimpeded. Multiply that against Iran's near-total dependence on oil exports and shipping revenue, and you start to see a regime bleeding out in a way that never shows up as a single dramatic headline, but compounds relentlessly every single day the blockade holds. Then there is the frozen asset situation, which might be the single most aggressive financial maneuver of this entire conflict, and it deserves far more attention than it has gotten. Washington has held a substantial pool of Iranian financial assets frozen for years, reportedly somewhere in the range of $124 to $167 billion, depending on which analyst's estimate you trust. The American announcement that damages caused by Iranian-backed attacks on Commercial shipping would simply be deducted directly from those frozen funds represents something close to a precedent-setting escalation. Iran's own foreign minister publicly warned that normalizing this kind of confiscation, using a state's frozen assets to cover damages caused by its proxies, sets a dangerous global precedent that could unsettle sovereign asset holders everywhere, not just Iran. That warning is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is essentially an Iranian official admitting out loud that the United States holds a form of financial leverage Iran simply has no real counter to. Now layer in the propaganda dimension, because this is where the situation becomes genuinely fascinating from an analytical standpoint. Iranian state media and official government statements have consistently framed this entire war as something forced onto Iran by outside powers, especially Israel, rather than the result of Tehran's own strategic decisions. That framing is not lazy or accidental. It is a deliberate domestic messaging strategy, aimed less at convincing the outside world and more at holding together internal political support during a period when the regime's actual military capacity has visibly collapsed. When Iranian officials insist, as they have repeatedly in recent weeks, that Iran, and not Washington, will decide when this war ends, that statement is not really a threat aimed at the Pentagon. It is a message aimed inward at Iranian citizens and regional allies, an attempt to project continuity and strength at precisely the moment both are in the shortest supply the regime has seen in decades. There is an internal power struggle running underneath all of this, too, and it matters more than people realize. Iran's response since losing the Tusca has notably not involved direct retaliation against American warships, which would risk immediate and overwhelming escalation that Iran simply cannot currently absorb. Instead, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy has fallen back on a tactic it has used for over a decade, seizing unrelated commercial vessels near its own coastline as bargaining leverage, a pattern intelligence analysts have tracked across multiple prior standoffs in the Gulf. Within days of losing the Tusca, Iran's Revolutionary Guard captured 2 foreign-flagged tankers near its coast, accusing them of unspecified maritime violations. Iranian officials have even floated the idea of demanding transit fees from any vessel passing through Hormuz, an attempt to reassert control over the strait through economic pressure. Since military pressure is currently off the table, diplomatically, the picture is just as fractured. Back in June, both sides reportedly reached a memorandum of understanding that would have unfrozen some Iranian assets in exchange for de-escalation. As of right now, neither side appears to be honoring it. A prior ceasefire has come and gone, broken repeatedly by strikes from both directions. Omani diplomats have shuttled back and forth between Washington and Tehran, trying to build some kind of durable framework for managing shipping through the strait, producing plenty of statements and photo opportunities, but nothing that is actually held together. Senior United Nations officials have publicly pushed both sides back toward the negotiating table, with one mediator stating plainly that there is no realistic path to ending this war outside of diplomacy. Iran's public position on this exact point is notably contradictory. Officials claim to support renewed talks in one breath, while insisting in the very next breath that Iran has no intention of sitting back down with Washington anytime soon. That contradiction is not a messaging failure. It is a fairly accurate reflection of where Iran's leadership actually sits right now. There is also a quieter struggle happening between Iran's conventional military and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, an ideological parallel force that controls much of Iran's missile program, its regional proxy network, and increasingly its economic assets too. The Guard has effectively driven the retaliatory strategy throughout this entire war, favoring proxy pressure and hostage-taking at sea, over the kind of direct confrontation Iran's conventional navy and air force are simply in no position to sustain. Every time state media highlights an IRGC tanker seizure instead of a naval engagement, it sends a small but telling signal about which institution is actually setting policy right now. And that matters enormously for anyone trying to predict Iran's next move, because the Guard has historically shown a far higher tolerance for risk and escalation than Iran's regular armed forces or its diplomatic corps. We are deep into this story now, and I want to pause for a second and genuinely thank you for sticking with it this far. If this kind of layered, honest breakdown is what you actually want from this channel instead of surface-level headlines, do me a quick favor and drop a comment telling me what part surprised you the most. It helps this video more than you would think, and I rate every single one. None of what we have covered so far changes what this war is actually costing real people on both sides, and that is worth slowing down for. Behind every ship seizure, every asset freeze, and every carefully worded state broadcast, there are people whose lives have been reduced to a single line in a Pentagon briefing or a state news release. It would be dishonest to move forward without acknowledging that, clearly, because both sides in this conflict have suffered in ways that do not reduce cleanly into strategy. Start with the crew of the Tusca itself. Iranian officials, in an unusually candid admission for a government that rarely explains its own hesitation, said their retaliatory response was being deliberately delayed because family members of the crew were reportedly on board the ship during the seizure. Whatever the ship was actually carrying, whatever its ownership structure was designed to obscure, the people physically standing on that deck, when Marines dropped down, were by all available accounts, working sailors and possibly their relatives, caught directly in the middle of a geopolitical confrontation they had absolutely no hand in creating. That remains true, regardless of what the cargo ultimately turns out to be. On the American and Allied side, the human cost has been just as real, even if it has been far less visible in daily coverage. The Pentagon has confirmed American service members killed in Iranian retaliatory strikes, including a young staff sergeant from Queens, New York, whose death at a U.S. airbase in Jordan was not officially confirmed until weeks after the fact. That delay drew legitimate criticism over how slowly military casualties have been disclosed throughout this entire war. Reports suggest close to 100 additional American troops have suffered injuries, officially described as mostly minor, though the true scope of that toll has reportedly been slow to reach the public record. Behind every one of those numbers is a family that found out their loved one was hurt or killed weeks after the fact, through official channels that move far slower than the news cycle around a seized cargo ship. Iranian civilians have absorbed real damage too. Strikes near a region home to one of Iran's key nuclear power facilities reportedly triggered air defense activations as explosions shook the surrounding area. In at least one province, a hospital was forced to relocate more than 200 patients after a nearby strike damaged surrounding homes and blew out windows across the district. That is the kind of incident that barely registers in Western coverage of a naval blockade, but represents a genuine disruptive crisis for the people actually living through it. Iranian state media has offered limited detail about the scale of damage in several coastal areas, which makes independent verification difficult, but the pattern of strikes intensifying alongside the naval campaign is consistent across multiple reports. And then there is the slower, quieter cost that never shows up in any single dramatic headline. The economic pain radiating outward from a shipping lane that carries a massive share of the world's oil. American drivers are reportedly paying close to 40% more at the pump than before this war began, a direct downstream consequence of instability in the strait, compounded by renewed attacks disrupting Red Sea shipping at the same time. That is not a headline built for outrage. It is a slow-motion tax on ordinary households thousands of miles from the Gulf, absorbed quietly every single time someone fills up a gas tank. It would be easy, and honestly a little lazy, to flatten this entire situation into a clean story of American strength against Iranian weakness, or flip it around into a story of American aggression against a cornered state. Neither framing survives contact with the actual human details underneath it. Washington's argument that a nation systematically evading sanctions to fund weapons programs and regional proxy militias forfeits some claim to unimpeded shipping rights is not unreasonable on its face. Iran's argument that a foreign navy disabling and boarding its commercial vessels in international waters amounts to an act of war regardless of what is sitting in the cargo hold is not unreasonable either, at least as a matter of principle, even when the regime making that argument has a long documented record of exactly the sanctions evasion it is now being punished for. There is no version of this conflict where the ordinary sailor, the young sergeant from Queens, or the family whose hospital ward had to be evacuated gets any say in how this plays out. They simply live with the consequences of decisions made in Washington and Tehran alike. That tension between the cold logic of strategic deterrence and the very real people caught inside it is exactly what makes predicting where this goes next so genuinely difficult. So, where does this actually go from here? Based on everything currently on the table, there are 4 distinct paths this could take, and they carry very different levels of risk. The first, and probably the path officials on both sides would publicly claim to prefer, is a genuine diplomatic breakthrough built around the current pause in American strikes. As of the most recent reporting, the United States had gone roughly 2 consecutive nights without launching new strikes on Iranian territory, described by officials close to the talks as a deliberate choice to give diplomacy room to work, rather than any kind of formal ceasefire. If Omani-brokered talks managed to produce something firmer than another abandoned agreement, this could plausibly become the first real de-escalation point since the war began. But here's the problem with that path. Both sides have already walked away from one negotiated framework this year, the June memorandum that was supposed to unfreeze assets in exchange for de-escalation and which collapsed almost immediately. A pause is not the same thing as trust, and nothing in the current diplomatic record suggests either government has built much of that yet. The second path, and arguably the more likely one given the pattern so far, is continued proxy escalation rather than direct confrontation. Iran has spent this entire conflict avoiding direct strikes on American warships, leaning instead on regional proxies, most visibly attacks on Red Sea shipping, alongside its own pattern of seizing unrelated commercial vessels near its coastline as bargaining chips. Expect more of exactly this. It is a strategy that lets Tehran project strength domestically without inviting the kind of overwhelming retaliation a direct strike on U.S. forces would guarantee. But this path has a problem too. Proxy escalation has already pushed oil prices past $100 a barrel once this year, and every additional attack risks pulling Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states more directly into the conflict, widening a war that Iran can increasingly least afford to widen. The third path is a more direct Iranian attempt to reassert control over the Strait of Hormuz itself through measures like the transit fees and coordination requirements Iranian officials have floated, effectively trying to claim informal authority over international waters through economic pressure, since military pressure is currently unavailable. This is a genuinely risky move for Tehran to attempt, and there is real weight behind the possibility of it happening in some form, specifically because it costs Iran almost nothing militarily while forcing Washington to either escalate to stop it or watch the entire blockade's credibility erode in front of the world. But here is the problem. Any attempt to functionally close or toll the strait almost certainly triggers an immediate American military response, given how explicitly Washington has framed free passage through Hormuz as a hard red line, and Iran's Navy is in no condition, according to the Pentagon's own assessment, to back up that kind of confrontation with actual force. The fourth and most volatile path is one that opened almost out of nowhere in the last few days, a genuine second front against Ukraine, following a Ukrainian strike on an Iranian vessel in the Caspian Sea that killed one person and injured 3 others. Iranian officials have already branded that strike an act of illegal aggression that cannot go unanswered. The uncomfortable logic connecting these two wars is Iran's deepening military relationship with Moscow, a partnership that has made Iranian assets legitimate targets inside Ukraine's broader fight for survival against Russia. If Iran responds to the Caspian incident with any kind of retaliation against Ukrainian interests, it opens a second active front at precisely the moment its military has the least capacity in years to fight on even one. Minimal capacity, combined with maximum overextension, is exactly the kind of combination that produces miscalculation. And miscalculation is historically how regional wars turn into something much larger. If you had to rank these 4 paths by what actually happens over the next several weeks, proxy escalation remains the most probable default, simply because it is the path Iran has already shown, repeatedly, it is willing to walk. The diplomatic breakthrough is possible, but fragile, and it would be unwise to bet on it holding without a far stronger enforcement mechanism than anything either side has produced so far. The Hormuz coercion attempt and the Ukraine front are both lower probability, but genuinely higher. Consequent scenarios, the kind of moves that could redefine this entire conflict's scale within days rather than months, if either one actually materializes. Which brings us back to where this story really started. Tehran keeps sitting down at this table and pushing its chips forward like it is still holding a strong hand. But strip away the statements and the state media framing, and what is actually left in front of the regime is a Navy, the Pentagon says, has been effectively neutralized, an Air Force scraping by on a fraction of its drone arsenal, an economy bleeding $500 million a day, and a diplomatic track record of walking away from its own signed agreements. A bluff only works as long as nobody calls it. And the United States, over the last several months, has been calling it methodically, one seized ship and one frozen dollar at a time. The seizure of the Tusca was never really about one ship. It was the moment this bluff started becoming visible from the outside, the moment it became unmistakably clear that Tehran's threats and its actual capacity to back them up had drifted far apart from each other. Months later, with a new front potentially opening against Ukraine and Iran's own military stretched thinner than at any point in recent memory, that gap between what Tehran says it can do and what it can actually do keeps widening. Whether that gap eventually forces Iran to the negotiating table on Washington's terms, or whether a cornered regime with nothing left to lose decides its best remaining move is to escalate anyway, is genuinely the open question heading into the next few weeks. Watch what happens the next time a ship tries to run this blockade. How Tehran responds to that single moment will tell you more about the real state of this war than any statement coming out of its foreign ministry ever could. So here's the question actually worth sitting with as you close this video. Does a government keep bluffing once everyone at the table can already see its hand? Or is refusing to fold even with nothing left to bet sometimes the only move a cornered regime believes it has left? Type your honest answer in the comments because I genuinely want to know what you think happens next. And if you want to be here the moment this story breaks one way or the other, subscribe now because this is far from over and you will not want to find out what happens next from somebody else's video.